And I'll just start by saying I'm delighted to see such an excellent turnout for this lecture. I'm not in the least bit surprised, but I am very pleased given the particular circumstances today. I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Amira Benison. I'm the head of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, and this is a wonderful opportunity for me to welcome you all, to welcome our distinguished guests in the front row, the Omani Ambassador, His Excellency Abdulaziz Abdullah Zahir al-Hinai and his colleagues from the Omani Embassy, and also his family. And it's a particular pleasure to have all of you here with us today to hear Khaled give his inaugural lecture. I would like to say, of course, before we start, that this has all been made possible by the very generous gift which was made to us by His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said in 2005. That enabled us to create a flagship professorship in modern Arabic studies, and I can say with complete sincerity, really invigorate the study of the modern Arab world within our faculty and department. And the post, as I'm sure all of you know, was first held by Professor Yasser Suleiman, a renowned sociolinguist who played a leading role in developing the study of the modern Arab world at the University of Cambridge. We realised that Professor Suleiman would be a hard act to follow when he retired last year, but we were absolutely delighted by the range of superb scholars who applied to fill his shoes and who saw Cambridge as the place to come to be a professor of modern Arabic studies. Our new appointee, Professor Khaled Fahmy, of course needs absolutely no introduction. Now, people always say that, but there are two very specific reasons why I think we can say that about Professor Fahmy. Firstly, and this is not always the case, although perhaps it should be, I'd like to say that he's already a familiar and well-loved fixture within the department itself, and indeed within the School of Arts and Humanities and the wider university. I've been particularly struck by the way that Professor Fahmy has made connections, worked with students, and joined in with all kinds of different events, almost the moment his feet hit the ground. And that was before he even had his furniture, which I think is saying something. So, we're immensely grateful to Professor Fahmy for the way he's joined us and taken the lead in moving modern Arabic studies into a new phase within the University of Cambridge and more broadly. The second reason, of course, that he needs absolutely no introduction is because his work as a historian. His work in particular on 19th century Egypt, the reign of Muhammad Ali Pasha, and I think most of our students now know that Muhammad Ali is not a boxer, which is pretty good. And of course his book, All the Pasha's Men, is widely read beyond the field, and that cannot be said for the work of all of us working on the Middle East and its history. I know people working on East Asia, on other parts of the globe, and they've all read this book as a result of its intellectual acuity, its innovative approach to the subject of the encounter with modernity, and the deep archival research which underpins it. And these were the characteristics of Professor Fahmy's work which drew us to appoint him in the first place. And the lecture tonight, which he's going to give us, Islam and Science in Modern Egypt, is a synopsis or a distillation of the work he's put into his forthcoming book, which is about this topic, and which is again going to be characterised by these methods of meticulous research and intellectual reflection on matters of importance, not just for 19th century Egypt, but for all of us today as we grapple with issues of the place of religion in modern life and the problems of our times. And it's incredibly enriching the way Professor Fahmy tackles these issues from shall we say, lateral perspectives, but also through hardcore work in archives, which really underpins what he does. Now, since you're not here to listen to me, but to listen to Professor Fahmy, I shall now hand over to Professor Fahmy to give his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amir, for this wonderful and generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. It gives me great pleasure to be here and to again, I want to extend my special thanks for His Excellency Sheikh Abdulaziz ibn Abdullah al-Aini as representatives of His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Saeed, the Sultan of Oman, who has generously funded this chair. I thank you for coming. I would like also to thank Ms. Reem Bahgat, the Cultural and Educational Attaché at the Egyptian Embassy in London, who is representing the Egyptian Ambassador, His Excellency Mr. Nasser Ahmad Kamel. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it a lot, especially for those of you who have come from overseas or from out of town. Thanks very much for the organizers in the department who've worked very laboriously and diligently over the past few weeks to make this possible. Now, for the past 10 years, I have been working on the social and cultural history of Egypt in the middle decades of the 19th century. As is well known, this period witnessed the first inklings of the intellectual, cultural, and political effervescence that is often referred to in English as the Arab Renaissance, al-Nahda. This exciting period of modern Arab history has naturally been the subject of countless studies that followed artists, writers, translators, scientists, and linguists in their critical engagement both with European modernity, Hadatha, and with Islamic tradition, the Turath. Most famously, Albert Hourani, in his 1962 classic Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age, set out to study how leading Arab luminaries in the 19th and 20th century grappled with liberalism, his euphemism for Western ideas, and celebrated those luminaries who succeeded in grafting European Enlightenment thought upon Islamic heritage. And while this Eurocentric approach had its own very clear, obvious shortcomings which Hourani was the first to acknowledge, and while it has been the subject of numerous critical engagements, most notably that of my dear friend Hussein Omar here in the audience, who has just published an insightful critique titled Arabic Thought in the Liberal Cage, the near obsession with the question of provenance, that is, European provenance of the Arab Nahda, has dominated scholarship for generations. So when I embarked upon this project more than 10 years ago, I wondered if it is possible to write a history of the Nahda, primarily an intellectual and artistic experience, without necessarily following an intellectual history approach. Specifically, I wondered how the Arab and Egyptian Renaissance of the 19th century would look like if approached corporeally. That is, if one takes the human body as one's unit of analysis. In my earlier study of Mehmed Ali's army, I attempted to answer a similar question. How differently this army might appear if one approaches it not through the impact it had on the minds of its soldiers, to see, for example, how these soldiers eventually came to realize that they were Egyptians rather than Ottomans or Muslims, but by studying this army through the impact it had on the soldiers' bodies, how these bodies were snatched from their villages, how they were subjected to meticulous drills, how they were disfigured during combat, how they perished on the battleground, and what happened to them when they were emptied of life. Likewise, in approaching the Arab Nahda of the 19th century in Egypt, I have been interested in viewing it not only as an intellectual event, but also as a corporeal phenomenon. Thus, I have been interested less in studying how ideas of equality, liberty, and constitutionalism made their way from their lofty European origins to be transplanted into the Arab, Ottoman, and Muslim body politic, in the words of Hourani's intellectual nemesis, Bernard Lewis, then in coming as close as possible to the bodies of average and less than average Egyptians, and to study their mundane quotidian lives, full as these lives were with the stuff of eating, defecation, urination, fornication, death, rot, and regeneration. After more than 10 years of research in the Egyptian National Archives, I have finally finished a monograph that I hope offers an engaging account of the corporeal history of the Egyptian Nahda, a monograph that includes chapters on such topics as homicide, sewage, rape, miasmas, and legal torture. By zooming in on medical, legal, and public hygienic reforms, my book asks how our understanding of Egyptian modernity would differ if pursued not via studying school textbooks, newspapers, or printing presses, but by having a close look at cemeteries, slaughterhouses, and cesspools. Rest assured, though, for given today's occasion, I thought to spare you these gory details and to concentrate instead on the innocuous, light-hearted, and uplifting topic of dissection. As I hope to illustrate in the remaining few minutes, dissection was insisted upon as an indispensable means to understand what the human body is composed of. But human bodies were also opened up as a way to ascertain the true cause of death in suspicious circumstances. Dissections and autopsies, therefore, are fundamentally important to follow how medicine and law, respectively, were radically transformed in 19th century Egypt. Studying how, why, and by whom the human body was opened up can go a long way to elucidate how medicine and law, the twin pillars of Egyptian modernity, were radically reconstituted in the 19th century. Studying how cadavers were opened up and examining the reactions such a disturbing practice elicited can, I believe, shed more light on the Arab Nahda than could be had by tracing the intellectual trajectory of liberalism. For dissections raise the questions that are in your leaflet, questions of ownership of the human body. To whom does the body belong? Does it belong to the person inhabiting it, or to the modern state that lays a new claim on it? Does it belong to the community in which it used to live and which honors and protects it after death, or to God, who, according to classic Islamic dogma, entrusted it to man to fulfill his wish in this world? In whose name and with what authority were bodies opened up? And who had an interest in pursuing such a disturbing practice that was assumed by some to violate religious norms and go against social mores? In an attempt to engage with these questions, it may be helpful to take a look at an oil painting. Sorry. It's not good. This doesn't help us at all. Oil painting or photograph doesn't help us much. But this might. And thank you, Mazen, my nephew, who took a picture of this painting from this museum. It's a museum that is seldom visited, nearly deserted, in Qasr al-Aini, which is the name of the Cairo University Faculty of Medicine. Like many museums in Egypt, this museum is as rich in its contents as the captions of these contents are tantalizingly brief and frustratingly incomplete. They are closer to being items in an inventory list than texts to inform, educate, or edify. The caption of this painting merely says, "The first dissection lesson in Egypt." The painting is not signed, and the caption gives no date, nor does it identify the painter. As cryptic as it is, I believe this painting makes a strong statement about the history of dissection in 19th century Egypt, and it tells us a lot about the strong resistance this dissection purportedly elicited from people who believed that this practice violated the basic tenets of Islam. So what does this painting say about Islam and dissection? At first glance, and with no knowledge about its date or the artist, it seems we have only wild guesses to go by. For like the event it commemorates, this painting is one of a kind, and it is difficult to situate it in an art historical context that can help explain the artist's meaning. Even if we insert the painting into the context of the rich classical Arabic medieval medical literature that is replete with manuscripts containing anatomical illustrations, a context to which I do not think it belongs. These illustrations do not depict anatomy lessons. Rather, as Professor Emily Savage-Smith has argued, they represent, quote, a highly schematic approach to human anatomy and could serve as a reasonable aid memoir for the user, even though they might give an inadequate representation of the structures themselves, unquote. However, by comparing our painting to early European Renaissance woodcuts that illustrate anatomy lessons, especially those lessons that were performed in Italian medical colleges, a central feature presents itself as a possible clue to the meaning of this painting. Down the centuries, these European images point to an ongoing dialogue, if not a tension, between the dissected body on the one hand and on the other, a medical text which is being recited aloud by a lector sitting behind an elevated lectern and which belongs, that is this medical tradition, to medical authorities that can be traced all the way back to Aristotle and Galen. Some of the earliest European Renaissance anatomical illustrations expressed this tension quite vividly. Even Rembrandt's famous painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, has been interpreted by William Heckscher in his classic 1958 study in this light, pointing out that the gazes of at least 5 of the 7 onlookers are directed not at the body being dissected, but at a book placed at the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. Heckscher argued that these anatomical paintings, quote, do not show us so much what had been seen as what was known to exist, unquote. Simply put, this tension was about what has precedence over the other, the text or the cadaver. Are the senses, especially those of touch and sight, to be trusted as to replace words? Is the corpus of classical medical literature to be discarded in favor of the direct observation of the dissected cadaver, or does the corpse only corroborate the teaching of the ancients? By contrast, our Egyptian painting lacks explicit references to any text, except perhaps the names of classical medical authors running along the amphitheater walls. At the center are the names of Galen, Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Herophilus, whereas the side walls are adorned by the names of Abu al-Qasim, Ibn al-Bitar, Ibn al-Faraj. Curiously, however, Ibn Sina's name is not there. However, there is another poignant, if subtle, reference to this telltale tension between cadaver and text at the very center of our painting. For surrounding the cadaver, the painter had placed a group of ulama, the custodians and interpreters of the text, one of them gesticulating excitingly at what is taking place in front of him. Compared to a much more famous dissection scene, that of the frontispiece of Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica of 1543, neither anatomist nor dissected cadaver demand our attention in our painting. Rather, it is the group of religious scholars who occupy center stage, and the painter arranged them in such a way as to obstruct the view of the students, thus preventing direct access to the cadaver, ostensibly the source of knowledge about the internal structure of the human body. Autopsy, which literally means to see with one's own eyes, is thus thwarted and obstructed by religion. This reading of the painting, wherein religion stands in the way of science, gains further credence by identifying the artist and dating the painter. It took me many years, and I eventually failed. But this colleague of mine, Anne-Marie Moulin, who is a scholar of 19th century Egyptian medicine, has managed to identify him as a certain Strikalovsky. There is a dispute. There are 2 of them, 2 brothers, both Russian, working in Egypt in various capacities. One of them ended up working as an illustrator for al-Aini textbooks. And both brothers have this amazing collection of 84 beautiful watercolors that are preserved in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and they are about Egyptian flies. They are just exquisite, and you can see them online because they're very beautifully scanned in the Smithsonian Institution webpage. The main thing, however, is that Strefkalowski, whether it is Roman or Nicholas, were active in Egypt in the 1930s, not the 1830s. So with more than a century separating him from the event he was commemorating, one wonders from where Strefkalowski derived his understanding of the circumstances surrounding the opening in Cairo of a medical school based on dissection. An obvious source, although slightly misleading, as I will argue, would be the copious writings of Dr. Antoine Barthélemy Clot, the French founding director of the school. Now, he's my hero or villain. He's the guy who kept my company after Muhammad Ali was put to rest. So there is also little doubt that the turbaned figure we saw in the painting is that of Dr. Clot himself. Born in Grenoble in 1793, Dr. Clot, or Claude Bey, as he famously came to be known in Egypt, he was given the honorific title of Bey in 1831 after he decided to stay in the country rather than flee in the wake of the famous cholera epidemic that swept this country here at the same time. So Muhammad Ali honored him by giving him the title of Bey. So Dr. Clot, or Claude Bey, as he famously came to be known, studied under Xavier Bichat, the founder of morbid anatomy, whose writings Foucault had analyzed in his famous Birth of the Clinic. In 1825, Claude Bey, or Clot, arrived in Egypt seeking employment in the budding administration of Muhammad Ali Pasha. In December of that year, 1825, the young doctor was introduced to this resourceful governor who had been ruling Egypt ostensibly on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan, but practically in his own right for nearly a quarter of a century. A few years prior, Muhammad Ali had experimented with founding a standing army, only to find out in a difficult way that the men he so laboriously gathered from the villages were falling prey to all kinds of diseases in barracks and military camps. A military medical corps needed to be founded, so the Pasha thought. And it is for that purpose that he sought the help of the French consul in Egypt, Drovetti of the famous antiquities pillaging repute, the guy who founded the Museum of Turin, to secure the services of a physician who could save the lives of his soldiers and stop the drain on his finances. This first encounter between these two men in December of 1825 had a profound impact on the history of the Pasha's army, but also of Egypt for generations to come. For in this meeting, Clot advised Muhammad Ali that although he could secure the medical services of many of his countrymen, doing so would cost the Pasha dearly. It would be wiser and cheaper, he said, to found a medical college to train hundreds of native doctors and pharmacists. Crucially, he argued that these native doctors should receive their education in Arabic in order to be able to communicate with their patients. It is very important to ponder the significance of this move. Claude Bey, a Marseille-trained, French-speaking doctor, advising Muhammad Ali, a Kavala-born, Turkish-speaking Ottoman governor, to found a medical school in Egypt where the Arabic-speaking natives would receive state-of-the-art medical education in their mother tongue. No sooner had Clot convinced the Pasha to set aside the necessary funds for founding a medical school, and that is how it looks, and committing the necessary funds for it, then he encountered a serious problem. For when he wrote to the Pasha telling him that the medical education he had in mind would be squarely based on dissecting human cadavers, he received a firm reply that cadavers were not to be touched. In his memoirs, Klo explains how, undeterred, he managed to overcome this formidable barrier. Quote, I harbored the hope that one day I would vanquish this prejudice, even though I clearly noted the profound disgust of the students and the fanatical opposition of the ulama, with whom I had communication on the subject. I applied myself to winning the confidence of Sheikh al-Islam al-Arusi, an important person who enjoyed a high reputation for holiness in the country. When I approached the question of anatomy, he would not give a single concession. His principal argument was that according to religion, cadavers could feel pain, to which I concurred, but added that bodies would decompose and become the prey of worms soon after death anyway. The Sheikh then argued that medical treatises published on such subjects should suffice for the instruction of the students. I responded that the theory provides no more than incomplete notions. A watchmaker, I told him, who has to repair watches, does he need not to understand the whole mechanism? Moreover, does he not have to put together and take apart the various pieces before he can understand how they operate? This image struck him, and I managed to obtain a tacit agreement to study anatomy, but to act with the greatest discretion and to do so in secret. Unquote. It is clear that Claude Bey is referring here to the theory of natural theology, which, simply put, argues that design implies a designer. This theory had become famous here in this country, in England, in 1802, with the publication of William Paley's book simply titled Natural Philosophy, in which he used the watchmaker analogy. This book was translated into French the following year, 1803. Claude might have read the French translation, but it is difficult to be certain about this point. Be that as it may, in his memoirs, published in 1949, Claude describes how, having received the tacit approval of the ulama, he proceeded to deal with the prejudices of the students. After placating them by promising them that he would never apply the scalpel to a Muslim's body and that he would only work on the bodies of black soldiers, work progressed slowly and cautiously on learning descriptive anatomy. Then, on the 20th of June, 1829, while watching a physiology lesson of a colleague, Claude was attacked by a student with a knife in his hand. Only by an instinctive move of the arm did he manage to avoid what could have been a fatal wound. The attacker was immediately grabbed and disarmed, and Claude ordered him detained in the hospital's jail. But the incident left him completely demoralized. Quote, I admit that from the time I was hit by the young fanatic man, a deep despondency seized me. Sacrificing one's life, giving up one's peace in order to conquer the prejudices of a people, to develop their intelligence, to extend to them the benefits of civilization, only to be rewarded by indifference, if not hatred, this thought overwhelmed my soul. Unquote. This image of Claude Bey as a man of science, rationality, and political acumen, confronting religious obscurantism and popular prejudice, is what he himself stressed in his numerous publications, both in French and in Arabic translations. Never a man to miss an opportunity to blow his own horn, Claude Bey's reputation in Egypt, however, rested more on the writings of his students and that of his students' students. Most notably, in 1935, one of those students published an account of the history of the school of al-Aini and of the heroic feats of Claude Bey in overcoming religious opposition to dissection. The author, famously known as Naguib Mahfouz, was the sub-dean of the school a century after its publication, and it is most likely that it is through Mahfouz's account, published, as I said, in 1935, not Claude Bey's memoirs, which were published only in 1949, that Sterkalovsky got his inspiration for his iconic picture of Claude Bey combating religious superstition. This is what Mahfouz says. Quote, the practice of dissection provoked much antagonism, not only from the ulama, but also from the students themselves. By steady perseverance, the ulama were induced to give their consent. On one occasion, one of the medical students, infuriated at seeing the bodies dissected, which is not true. It was another lesson about physiology, not in a lesson about dissection, that someone attempted to kill Claude Bey, stabbing him on the forehead and chest. By a fortunate movement of the arm, Claude evaded the attack. The other students soon intervened, and the student was taken into custody. Claude Bey calmly completed his lecture to the great admiration of the class. Unquote. Before critically analyzing these accounts of European science confronting Islamic opposition, it is worth noting that Dr. Naguib Mahfouz is the reason why our famous novelist, Naguib Mahfouz, acquired his name. The story goes that when the novelist's mother was in labor delivering him, and when the midwife who had been fetched to help with the delivery panicked, seeing that this would be a difficult labor, a decision was taken to fetch the most famous gynecologist of his time, Dr. Naguib Mahfouz. Following the successful delivery, the parents decided to name the baby after the famous doctor. And there are many interesting anecdotes about people getting confused between both of them. Some of the novelist's followers went to Naguib Mahfouz, the doctor, and this is a man of science, and he didn't understand who these guys, fictitious figures from the novelist's works, and he kept on telling them, you're just talking nonsense. And so there are a number of anecdotes about this. But the reason I'm mentioning this, what makes this anecdote interesting, is that Naguib Mahfouz, the novelist, had something in common with his namesake's hero, Claude Bey. For towards the end of his life, Naguib Mahfouz, the novelist, was also the victim of an assassination attempt. Like the great doctor, Mahfouz, the novelist, was stabbed in the neck by a religious fanatic who had found his novel, Children of Gabalawi, offensive for the manner it purportedly depicted the divine being. Islam then stands accused of being in opposition to free expression, as it has been accused of being an obstacle to science and enlightenment. But let us leave aside the question of Islam and literature and attend to the question at hand, Islam's opposition to science in general, medicine in particular, and dissection in 19th century Egypt, to be more precise. As gripping as Claude Bey's account of his encounter with the ulama is, it raises more questions than it answers. Was he correct in sensing that their opposition to dissection was doctrinally based? Did the ulama whom he reached out to really believe that cadavers could feel pain? Or did their opposition to dissection have other reasons? And sticking to our painting and to the animated students following this historic lesson, who were these students and how did they end up in the school? What careers did they pursue upon graduation, and what social status did they enjoy as bearers of medical diplomas? More importantly, did they share with their professor his belief that science and religion represented two distinct fields of thought? Or did they agree with classical Muslim physicians, those physicians whose names they read on the walls of their classrooms, in rejecting such binary distinction? In light of the ulama's ostensible opposition to dissection, as well as Muhammad Ali's directive to Claude Bey to proceed with caution, the presence of guards at the entrance points to the purported hostility of wider society to what was going on inside these hallowed halls. Did dissection elicit negative reactions from non-elite Egyptians? And if so, what was their understanding of modern medicine? Furthermore, and when we realize that opening cadavers was performed not only for the purposes of medical pedagogy, but was also routinely practiced to ascertain the cause of death for legal purposes, how did non-elite Egyptians react to this encroachment on what was literally a matter of life and death? Moreover, dissections and post-mortem examinations were part of a much larger set of practices by which the newly evolving Egyptian state laid its control and its hands on the bodies of its citizens. Examples of these practices included registration at birth, vaccination against smallpox, conscription, branding of criminals, routine medical examinations of students, of workers, of sailors, and of soldiers, and having stamped certificates to bury the dead in order for the state to update its vital statistics. When I teach modern Egyptian history, this piece of paper is no bigger than this. I have some of them, 5 or 6 copies. I tell my students, this for me is the most important document that is the best example of how modern the Egyptian state had become. Out of the thousands and thousands of documents that I have read, it is this document because it gives you an indication of how self-confident the state is. A state that can claim to be able to account for the death of every single person living in its terrain and to register it and to keep these statistics updated in a constant way. This, I think, is quite phenomenal. This is done in villages and it's done in the cities. This then is how I attempt to answer this large question of Islam's opposition to dissection. I contrast different doctrinal positions articulated by religious scholars with actions taken by doctors who themselves were graduates of Quran schools before they entered Qasr al-Aini. And then I study the reactions of lower class Egyptians to these disturbing practices. So 3 levels, so bear with me, let us take them one at a time. Let's start with doctrine, and then the position of doctors, and then the position of lower class Egyptians at large. Let's start with the fuqaha and the ulama, the jurists and the scholars of religion. Once again, Emily Savage Smith comes to our rescue. In an exhaustive study on the position of Islamic fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, regarding dissection, she concluded that there was, quote, no explicit legal or religious strictures banning dissection. Indeed, many Muslim scholars lauded the study of anatomy primarily as a way of demonstrating the design and wisdom of God, unquote. Naturally, the issue for post-classical jurists was never one of dissection for medical or for forensic purposes. Rather, the question was typically posed to illustrate some fiqhi principle and to clarify the hierarchy of various fiqhi rules, various legal principles. For example, to stress the importance of the principle of the right of the property owner to his or her property, the jurists raised the hypothetical question of whether or not it was permissible to open the belly of a dead man who had swollen some coins or jewelry and then, quote, red-handed, and then died. It's a bizarre example, but they want to illustrate to what degree is it mandatory for this person to receive the exact property rather than a financial compensation for it, for stolen property. Ibn Hazm, who died in 1064, gave an affirmative answer to this question, arguing that the exact property, rather than financial compensation in case of loss or damage, should be rendered back to the property owner. Much later, in the 20th century, Rashid Rida gave an affirmative question to the answer to the question of whether or not Islam allows post-mortem examinations. He's the editor of Al-Manar, the famous magazine, and he received questions from as far away as Montenegro and India. And in a famous fatwa that he issued to the person from India, in 1908, he opined that post-mortem examination was allowed since, quote, it is a worldly matter, من المسائل الدنيوية, and not a religious one, ليست عبادة, unquote. The fatwa referred explicitly to the health regulations that had been placed in Egypt and said that post-mortem examinations which aimed at determining the cause of death was considered a public good, مصلحة عامة, and it should take precedence over the principle of dignifying the dead, takrim al-mayyit. In a later fatwa from 1910, answering the question from Montenegro, he reiterated that line of thinking and said that the sunnah of prompt burial could be dropped if there existed the slightest doubt in determining the cause of death. But this is the 20th century, and Ibn Hazm is the 10th century. What about the 19th century? We as historians, we have to ask this question. What about these men? Even though this is a 20th century painting, but this event. I found no fatwa from Egyptian ulama in the 19th century for or against dissection. The only explicit doctrinally based position of 19th century Egyptian ulama regarding dissection and post-mortem examinations in general relates to the question, not to the question of the inscrutability of the human body, but to the question of delayed burials that such examinations necessarily entailed. So people would write petitions. We don't care how long this, what you do, but finish quickly. That was the petitions, the gist of these petitions presented to the authorities. In response, Abbas Pasha, Mehmed Ali's successor, the ruler of Egypt, issued strict orders that doctors had to conduct their post-mortem examinations promptly and set down clear punishments for those doctors who failed to do so. The directive specified that checking the dead should be conducted during daytime from 1 hour after sunrise to 1 hour before sunset. At the same time, however, strict orders were issued to local authorities not to be too hasty in burying the dead. A waiting period of 8 hours in summer and 10 hours in winters was mandated. Death was no longer a private matter and had to be certified by the neighborhood or village physician to avoid the grave error of mistaking fainting for death and burying people alive. That's the most serious concern. The concern about prompt burial is also what lies behind the following police case involving 2 sheikhs. These are the cases that I love. These are the police cases that I have spent with Ruth Peters sitting up front here, many, many years enjoying ourselves in the Egyptian archives reading. The case is about these 2 sheikhs who had a kuttab, a Quran school, outside the perimeters of the city. And they received these young kids. One of them is a 15-year-old kid from across the river, from Giza. His father sent him to memorize the Quran during the month of Ramadan. After Ramadan was over, he didn't return. So the father went to fetch him, only to be told that his son had died 3 days prior. And they told him he had died on the mill, the water mill. And he found blood-stained clothes there. So he went to the police to report the case, accusing the 2 sheikhs for murdering his son. The police conducted their investigations and found no foul play. But they were questioned, and they said, well, the boy died, we did the rituals, we cleansed the body, we put it in a shroud, and we buried it. And we didn't think that we should delay it, because delaying burial is not proper. التأخير عن ذلك ليس من الصواب. They were found guilty for violating health regulations, and the case went all the way up to Abbas Pasha, because he was horrified to discover that such an entire neighborhood had been completely devoid of any health regulations. Where is the doctor who was supposed to have to be following this entire neighborhood? And how come these 2 sheikhs are conducting their business in such a cavalier manner? In this, as in numerous other police cases I consulted in the archives, I found no evidence that the ulama's opposition to dissection was based on some doctrinal basis. There is no evidence in the records that the ulama believed that Muslim corpses could feel pain, as Klopp Bey claimed. The only point of doctrine, as I said, is the one of delayed burial. There was opposition to various medical practices, but this opposition can better be seen as stemming from the increasingly marginalized position that the religious establishment found itself in during the 19th century. With the new regulations stipulating that it was doctors now who could define death rather than religious scholars, the ulama found their position being seriously challenged by the new graduates of al-Aini. While not doubting the veracity of Klopp Bey's account with the Azhari, of his encounter with the Azhari ulama, therefore, I am skeptical about the meaning he gave it. In addition to factoring in his general anti-clerical stance, a stance he shared with many of his revolutionary compatriots regarding religion in general and not only Islam, I would also factor in the new social context in which the ulama found themselves, and would prefer to read the rare pronouncements about dissection in light of what they rightly perceive to be a relative decline in their social status. Now, if we move to Qasr al-Aini students, who, as I said, they themselves had been religious seminary students, joined the Qasr al-Aini, and then many of them would replace their European teachers and assume the position of professors in their own alma mater. Once again, I do not doubt the veracity of Klobbé's account. That there was a stigma associated with dissecting bodies in Qasr al-Aini is not in doubt. Nor is it contested that Klobbé was indeed attacked by one of his students. The question, rather, is how correct Klo was in arguing that this opposition to dissection stemmed from an Islamic doctrinal prohibition to opening up cadavers. For one thing, Klobbé's paraphrasing of Shaykh al-Arouzi's argument that cadavers could feel pain seems to be based on a misreading of the prophetic hadith. Breaking the bones of a person when dead is like breaking them when alive. A hadith that can be understood to censure grave robbers rather than set a prohibition on opening cadavers per se. For another, his allusion to the natural theology argument of the divine watchmaker betrays a presupposition that the violation of the divine prohibition on opening the inscrutable body was behind the opposition to dissection. In Europe, as much as in Egypt, a presupposition that has been seriously challenged by scholars working on European societies as that of Renaissance Italy and France. In his groundbreaking study, Books of the Dead, Andrea Carlino argues that it was scholarly rigidity which was behind the strong academic hostility to dissection in medical schools. The overwhelming evidence of the ancient authorities and not church dogma outweighed the evidence of dissection, and the professors who conducted dissections to illustrate the validity of the ancient authors, quote, often did not believe what was actually before them, unquote, with the result that it took nearly 2 centuries from Mondino to Vesalius for sensory perception to establish itself decisively over the textual authority of the ancients. The disturbances that occasionally accompanied the dissection lessons, therefore, were not rooted in a perceived violation of church dogma about the inviolability of the human body. Rather, they might have been provoked by relatives and friends who protested the profanation of the remains of their loved ones, by spectators at dissections, by barbers and surgeons over the exuberant entrance fees. These are the arguments that are put forward by Carlino. Might similar concerns have informed the attitude of Klobbé's students towards dissections? Luckily, a number of those students were later sent to France to continue their medical education. Upon returning home, they translated the textbooks they had studied and wrote lengthy introductions to these translations. As such, these translations and writings offer an important insight on the relationship between Islam and science in 19th century Egypt, and allow us to examine what these former Azhari students might have thought regarding dissection and how they reconciled their beliefs and their new medical profession. They too are Muslims. They too I take seriously. It's not only the ulama who have the right to speak on behalf of Islam. The eloquent introductions these students wrote for the books they translated show not only how much they viewed their scientific endeavors as deepening their belief in God, but also how these endeavors themselves were part of their faith. They paid homage to Bichat and Lavoisier. They extolled Ibn Sina, Galen, and Hippocrates, and they profusely thanked the rulers of Egypt for reviving an old science which they believed had been born in Egypt. Above all, however, it is God whom they thanked. Every single book and medical and chemical book published in Egypt by the Bulaq Press in its first 50 years of its history started with a rhymed, spirited introduction praising God for his bounty and marveling at his creation. These introductions are craftily written, playing on some of God's attributes that are relevant to the topic of the book being translated. For example, the translators of a book on anatomy, which eventually was translated in Arabic under the title of قول الصريح في علم التشريح, the first medical book published in Egypt, very early on, 1832, wrote in their introduction, quote, "Praise be to him who has created man in such good form, who composed his body of bones, nerves, veins, and cartilages, who expanded the chest," playing on the word شرح الصدر, chest of whoever wants to marvel at its form and constituent parts, unquote. A book on apothecary, published in 1840, opened with the following words addressing the Almighty, quote, "You whose mere mention is the best remedy for man, and whose praise is the best antidote for hearts and bodies, glory be to your majesty, in which the bodies of those who love you dissolve. The mere mention of you is a balsam that can cure all their ills, and praying to you is an elixir that can remedy all sickness," unquote. Finally, the translators and editors of a chemistry textbook wrote in their introduction, quote, "You to whom pure souls rise, and in whose majesty bodies dissolve, and on the thresholds of whose mercy bodies prostrate, your exalted being knows neither composition nor decomposition, and your sublime attributes do not change nor morph. There is no God but you, who has created for us earth with its metals, plants, and animals, and who has brought into being food that is sweet, sour, tasty, and salty," unquote. This attitude of not seeing a contradiction between personal belief and Islamic doctrine on the one hand, and modern medicine and practice of dissection on the other hand, is to be found most clearly in the works of Muhammad al-Shabasi, one of the early graduates of Qasr al-Aini. He was a member of the first education mission sent to France in 1832. Spent 8 years, and upon his return, he was appointed to a senior teaching position in his alma mater. He also worked as a condition to be appointed in the school. He had to translate all these guys. He had to translate one of the textbooks that they studied. And what book did he choose? He chose one of the most difficult books, this book by Cuvelier, which continues till today to be a beautiful book to watch because of its unsurpassed medical illustrations. But a few years later, he published his own book, not a translation, but a book called التنوير في قواعد التحضير. And it's an aid, a manual for how to perform dissection, how to prepare, hence the word tahdir, the corpse for autopsy. It was this latter book that was the basis of his fame. If we are to believe what he says about it in his own preface, he says, and its impact on his students, it appears to have been a smashing success. Students, when they were in the habit of taking corpses to their lodgings to learn about human anatomy, and they did not find it problematic to sleep in the same rooms where dead bodies were kept, heedless of the criticisms that this behavior necessarily triggered. This is a famous anecdote in all history books, not only Egyptian. Galen mentions it, and many other European anatomists mention it. But this is what is significant. In the preface of his second book, of this book, al-Shabasi states explicitly that, quote, "It is common knowledge among civilized nations that medicine cannot advance except by practicing dissection. Opening cadavers has many benefits. Among them are acquiring the knowledge of how healthy organs might have looked like immediately prior to death. It also enables us to identify pathological transformations that affect each organ and to compare them to symptoms detected just before death, and thus help us diagnose illness." This morbid anatomy. It also can be useful in problems related to forensic medicine, such as burns, poisoning, homicides, drowning, falling from a high place, or dangerous wounds. Moreover, it can be of use in pointing out dangers that should be avoided while conducting small or major surgical operations, unquote. Adding to these medical benefits, al-Shabasi finds no problem in adding in the same breath quote, marveling at the precise functioning of the organs and meditating on God's creatures, which deepens and strengthens one's faith, unquote. He then paraphrases Galen by saying, reading anatomy books is the greatest of all acts of worship, and it forces one to acknowledge God's oneness, unquote. Throughout his book, al-Shabasi follows the tradition of medieval Muslim physicians who saw no contradiction between their personal faith and their medical profession. This harmonious view of his Islam and his practice of dissection is seen most clearly in the conclusion, where he dwells on the importance of dissection for forensic medicine. I find this marvelous. Quote, the value of dissection can be illustrated by the example of 3 people who all drowned at the same time. Consequently, we have a problem of inheritance. How to divide the inheritance. Specifically, and a problem that can only be resolved if we determine who had died first. Specifically, one person might have died after suffering from blood coagulation in the brain and then died of a stroke. The second by fainting, and the third by asphyxiation. In this case, only the forensic doctor can deduce from the conditions of the arteries, the veins, the hearts, the lungs, and the brain certain rational conclusions based on visual signs, not on guessing and surmising. ظن وتخمين. The same can be said in other similar cases, as when people die at the same time in an earthquake, the collapse of a building, or a fire, unquote. In his very last remark, al-Shabasi reminds his students of the importance of diligence in their work and cautions them not to jump to easy conclusions. Quote, when the forensic doctor comes across a dead body in the street, he should be very careful in how to determine the cause of death. For if he says that the victim had died as a result of a brain stroke, that is natural death, but when in fact death was caused otherwise, unnaturally, then 2 errors will have been committed. The first, the Sharia stipulated capital punishment, qasas, would have been forsaken. The second, the state would have recorded this wrongly in its death registers. And these is what they call. These are amazing registers giving the name, the location, the cause of death, the age of every single person who died. The ease by which this former Azhari student, who held the chair of Professor of Physiology and Pathological Anatomy in Qasr al-Aini, could combine his understanding of Islam with his belief in the value of human dissection is a far cry from Klobbe's assertion that religious superstitions hampered his work in Egypt. In Shabasi's remarkable book, which was intended not for the general public but for medical students, al-Shabasi clearly explains how dissection could be of aid not only to medical education but also to the proper collection of vital statistics. And it is most remarkable what is most remarkable, to upholding the Islamic principle of retaliation for a medically proven case of homicide. The last bit. If neither the ulama in 19th century Egypt nor the doctors of Qasr al-Aini seem to have posed serious objections to dissection, we reach the same conclusion when we examine the reaction to dissection by lower class Egyptians, who appear not to have resisted or dismissed it outright. To be sure, the sight of or even the contact with dead bodies must have evoked feelings of horror, disgust, and shock. And as Savage Smith observes, attitudes toward dissections were informed by, quote, the general human dread of cadavers and the revulsion of the sight of human dissection, combined with a climate most unfavorable for such an undertaking before the days of refrigeration. Cutting into a corpse, especially a human one, is a messy and painstaking endeavor, which under the best of conditions requires a strong motivation to carry out, unquote. However, police and the court records, the ones we've been reading for many years in the Egyptian archives, show that as disturbing as they might have considered autopsy, lower class Egyptians not infrequently insisted on an autopsy when they suspected that a loved one had been murdered and that the only way to achieve justice was by asking, during the inquest, for an external post-mortem examination, even if this entailed exhuming the body. It is this quest for justice that trumped any religious or cultural opposition to dissection. And it is this quest for justice that led me to the particular choice of title for my forthcoming book. Let me then end with a case that best illustrates the Egyptians' readiness to use forensic medicine to protect their rights and to achieve justice. It is a case that I'm very fond of, and excuse me those of you who've heard it before, but I'm never tired of repeating it. It's a case of a woman called Mahbouba, a young woman from a small village in the Minya province in Upper Egypt. It is a case that sums up what the creation of a modern state meant for common Egyptians, how this state deployed techniques that enabled it to lay claim on their bodies, and how they in turn fought back to reclaim their bodies. In the summer of 1857, Mahbouba's husband, Ali Gadallah, was summoned for corvée labor on the Cairo-Suez railway line. On the way to perform his duty, Ali escaped, prompting his village sheikh, Sheikh Muhammad al-Sha'rawi, to search for him at all costs. He went to Ali's home, thinking that Ali had preferred to stay in the comfort of his small family, composed of his wife, Mahbouba, their young son, and his mother-in-law. When Sha'rawi could not find him, he arrested Mahbouba instead, very much like what the Egyptian police do today, and had her imprisoned in the village jail. While in custody, he beat her severely to confess as to her husband's whereabouts. Eventually, and realizing that his severe beatings may lead to her death, Sha'rawi had Mahbouba delivered to her home, where she soon died. At this point, Ali, the husband, appeared from hiding, and together with his mother-in-law, that is Mahbouba's mother, went to the local Sharia court to bring charges against Sheikh Sha'rawi, accusing him of causing Mahbouba's death. They actually brought Mahbouba's body, wrapped in a shroud, put it in front of the Qadi, and demanded a post-mortem examination. But the Qadi refused this request, saying that only a physician could undertake such an examination. He then proceeded to handle the case according to the Islamic law of evidence. He questioned Sha'rawi about the charge, but Sha'rawi denied the allegations. The Qadi then asked the claimants if they had any witnesses to the act of beating, but they answered that since the beating had taken place in jail, they could provide no witnesses. Finally, the Qadi asked them to fetch the village female corpse washer to inquire from her if she had detected any contusions on Mahbouba's body while preparing it for burial. But as luck would have it, the woman who had performed this ritual in the village happened to be Mahbouba's mother, whose testimony could therefore not be accepted, and who, in a cruel twist of fate, was blind. Lacking a confession by the defendant or an eyewitness account, the Qadi could not rule for the claimants, and the case had to be dropped according to fiqh. But both Ali and his mother-in-law did not give up. Confronted by what they believed was a prejudice of the Qadi, they took Mahbouba's body, hurled it on top of a camel, and roamed the countryside with it, seeking the help of a doctor who would conduct a post-mortem examination. Finally, in the provincial town of Qulusna, the deputy doctor answered the request. In his report, he wrote that, quote, he had found signs of severe beating by a palm leaf, garida, on the deceased's chest, up to her face, and from her shoulders down to her wrists, and that blood had been oozing out of her mouth, unquote. He concluded by saying that Mahbouba's death had been caused by beating. The claimants felt vindicated and, quote, they clung to what had been revealed by the doctor's report. تمسكوا بما توضح بكشف الحكيم. Based on the medical report, the police found Muhammad al-Sha'rawi guilty of causing Mahbouba's death and sentenced him to prison for 5 years. There is no better case than Mahbouba's to illustrate both the degree to which the Egyptian state in a little less than a century had managed to establish firm control over the natural resources of the country, as well as the resourcefulness with which Egyptians accommodated this new machine that controlled all aspects of their lives from birth to death. This tragic story illustrates how there was little about this modern state that Egyptians could be happy with. Egypt could pride itself, indeed, for being the first country outside Europe and North America to build railways. The Cairo-Suez railway line, completed just 1 year following Mahbouba's death, is a good example not only of the diplomatic and technical proficiency that the Egyptian state had achieved by mid-century, but also of the efficient policing and precise census taking that allowed tens of thousands of peasants like Ali Gadallah to be pressed in corvée in order to make possible the rail link between Cairo and Suez. For Mahbouba, however, the Cairo-Suez railway line and the modern state that lay behind it were an unmitigated disaster. Her husband was dragged to the corvée, the village head abducted her own son, and she herself paid with her life for a project that could hardly be less relevant to her happiness and well-being. What Mahbouba's case illustrates is how resourceful and quick non-elite Egyptians were in appropriating the novel techniques of the state for their own purpose. This state might not have been created to serve them. It might have controlled their bodies in ever tighter ways. It might have extended its gaze beyond life and subjected the dead to close scrutiny. But as Mahbouba's husband and mother show, Egyptians in their quest for justice spared no effort to make the state serve them, and they stopped at nothing in their constant struggle to live in peace and die with dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll join me in agreeing that that was a wonderfully rich exploration of the ins and outs of dissection in 19th century Egypt. Professor Fahmy has kindly agreed to answer a few questions from the floor, but after that I would just remind you all that there is a reception outside, and that will also give the opportunity for you to mingle more informally and ask additional questions after this session. So would anyone like to ask a question?
Yes. Thank you very much. It was absolutely fantastic. It's not a question, it's just a comparison like that. And now, have you read Dr. Zhivago by Pasternak? Not was the film?
No.
But Oman City. There's a very beautiful episode about dissection with dead bodies and how young Dr. Zhivago is explaining how important it is. And it's actually very, very similar to what we were talking about in the beginning. Is there a short comment? And how the involvement of divine should be interpreted.
Yes.
Thank you.
Professor, that was great. Thank you for that. What was the earliest dated autopsy, criminal autopsy then in certainly 19th century Egypt?
For forensic purposes.
Yeah.
The ones that I have found are from the 1850s. I think that is the earliest I could find. I can't remember the exact dates, but the school was founded in 1827. The students returned from their missions in the late 1840s. So it's by the mid 1850s that I start finding references, and this whole project as I'm going to share with students tomorrow in our workshop. This whole project started by these police records. It's when I found them and I said to myself, you know, okay, this is fantastic stories, but it's this detail about the forensic doctor's report that is included within the police report that I thought, well, this needs work.
So the attitude of Claude Bay seems to be at variance from the very different reality that you very convincingly showed existed in Egypt. And so my question is, how do you explain this attitude? So if we, probably wasn't fabricating this perception, but why did he develop such a perception that was so in variance with the reality of this attitude of the ulama, lower class Egyptians, but at the same time even the medical students?
Thanks, Hazem. Wonderful question. It took me a while. It took me a long time to figure it out. The reason why I spent so much time dwelling upon it is to say that this has become the standard account. This is what people repeat, especially because of Naguib Mahfouz. My explanation is that he was not making it up. There was opposition. I'm trying to say where it might have come from. I think in general, he is informed by two principles. One is a very strong anti-clerical attitude towards the church. I mean, this is the medical training he learned in France. He's a man of science. This is superstition, and his understanding of this hadith, I think, he translated it to what he thought men of science believed religion to say, especially the church, which, those who work on, the medical historians who work on history of medicine in France at that time and earlier have refuted. The church was never the real obstacle to dissection. The second one is his position in Egypt. It's a peculiar position. And it's peculiar because, on the one hand, it is a typical colonial one. European man coming to, as he says, a backward country to enlighten them and enhance their intelligence. And this is his self-perception as well as a man of science. So he's a European man of science coming to a country with no science and not Europe. What makes it peculiar and this is what I constantly say, and Hussein here knows this, that Egypt is a peculiar case to study because this is not a typical colonial moment. This is not India. And European medicine is deployed in Egypt in a very different way than European medicine was deployed in Africa or in India. The example I stopped at, and there are many others, the fact that he gives an advice to found the medical school in Arabic. That's not a typical colonial gesture. That's very peculiar. The fact that he is actually employed by the Egyptian state, he's not sent by Paris. He doesn't answer to Paris. He's an employee of Egypt. But most seriously, despite all of this, there is another side of Claude Bay that's important to highlight, that he actually never thought the way many British doctors thought of Indian bodies, that they are ultimately and constitutionally incapable of self-rule. He actually thought that with proper education, Egyptians will be able to take care of their bodies and their minds. Hence the need for a school. We will not import. He said, I have my fellow doctors. I can invite them, they'll be here in no time. But for you to have a proper foundation, you have to open a school. And the interesting thing is that he believed that Egyptian doctors will be good doctors. the last thing that I would say is that this is why he's a complex figure. Despite this, he refused to allow them to carry the title of doctor. So doctors are Europeans, they are hakims, but it's the same education, and he believed not only in their education, but in their ability to inculcate habits of self-management and self-rule to their patients. It's very different from India.
How would you assess the state's kind of insistence on building state institutions with the growth of medicine in Egypt, rather than it being kind of a organic movement towards education, rather than a state-enforced institution?
Beautiful question. Beautiful question. That's, for me, that's the $1 billion question, honestly. We in Egypt have been told, especially by the current regime, thank your luck that we have a strong state. And I say a strong state is needed. The problem in Egypt is that the state is too strong. It had quashed society. It had aborted the opportunity of, as you're implying, an opportunity of indigenous medicine, of doctors not serving the state, of doctors serving their neighborhoods, of doctors receiving education and not ending up being state employees, but answering to their communities. The Egyptian state, in my mind, this state that we, pride ourselves with, for me, had come with a huge cost. The cost of what it meant for local, individual communities and their initiatives and their sense of self-worth. The Egyptian state has quashed this and continues to do so at a huge expense. And we will live for generations to come, suffering from this.
Let's have one more question. Sorry.
No.
Thank you very much.
Okay, there's 2 more questions.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So
I just
people
nodded
can
at
be
him.
waiting.
I took your...
No, that's all right. 2 more questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khaled, for a very interesting presentation. I have kind of 2 questions, very brief questions. So the first question is about Dr. Muhammad al-Shirazi. And he's saying he's trying to sort of marry his formal beliefs or his beliefs in Islam. Islam is kind of very okay with the notion of dissection, with the notion of using medicine in that way. But of course, isn't it very typical that he would say something like that? Of course he has to say something like that because the overwhelming culture or the dominant culture in Egypt is basically one that kind of resorts to Islam in that way. So isn't it typical? Does it really say anything about his beliefs? He has to make the show, of course, in the beginning of the book. And the other thing is basically about the example he gave at the end, about common Egyptians basically using the forensics to take the rights or something. My idea here is it seems like it's a very romanticized anecdote. It's a very powerful anecdote, but it's very romanticized because, of course, if I'm promoting science, that's exactly what I would say. The report has to say something like that. So I was wondering if there's a counter kind of intuitive argument or explanation to that.
The first point, I don't think so. This is not a polemical book. This is not a book for the wider masses. This is a book for his students. This is a textbook. This is where he's actually thinking aloud to his students. It's a small community. But I understand where your question is coming from. And I'm urging you to rethink this period and take it seriously in its own terms. I know that Mehmed Ali or Muhammad Ali had been dismissed as playing with religion and not being very serious. Muhammad Ali is a Muslim ruler through and through. Not necessarily Muslim by meaning that he's pious, but his world is a Muslim world. He's an Ottoman Muslim, He's fighting with the ulama, but as a Muslim. Not as a Europeanized person who has given up on his heritage. He is and there is ulama and ulama. And he wants the ulama who will help him. And he doesn't like the ulama who will not help him. And he says, look, you know, the Quran has been revealed in 23 years. For sure, you will find me a verse that I can use for these people who want to gather together in times of epidemics to pray for God. In times of epidemics, we impose quarantines. We do not pray. He tells them this. And he finds hadiths to do this. Now, for me, he's actually not being cynical. He's actually, I think, in his private letters to his son, private letters, he says constantly, I will face God. I do not want to face God with thousands of souls stuck from my neck. I have a duty to save their souls. These ulama, they're ignorant. We cannot allow them to have their say. He has his own ulama. In his mind, they're not ignorant. So it depends on how you want to view it. Now, Mahbouba is the dramatic case, but believe me, I found many other cases of Copts, of Muslims, people in cities, people in the countryside, people from Upper Egypt, people from Cairo, who do this. It's not every case, but it's cases of justice. When you are confronted with a case like this, you go that far. And I remember, I'm sorry, I'll just add one. The title of Inquest of Justice, frankly, came to my mind. I've been working on this project for 8 years prior to the outbreak of the revolution in Egypt. And I had been gathering stories and I was going into different directions and so on. Then, in November of 2011, I went to the morgue for the first time. Sadly, not for the last time. I went to the morgue in solidarity of a family of a victim of police brutality. The police had killed Hassam Ata, a person who I've never heard of before, and we went in solidarity of the family. And in the morgue, the minute I entered, I found this young guy fighting on the phone with someone. Turns out it was his uncle, and he was saying, we will open him up, come what may. It turns out that this is the victim's brother having a fight with his uncle because the uncle wanted to bury the body and be done with it. Let's not have a confrontation with the police. Muhammad Ata, with whom I became friends later on, was insisting that his brother had been killed. He will get his justice and he will revenge his death. Muhammad was illiterate. Today, Muhammad learned how to read and write. He's suing the Egyptian government in front of the African Commission of Human Rights after he had exhausted and failed in doing so domestically. And the case is still pending, and I'm dedicating my book to him. And it was in that moment that I said, oh my God, I've seen this before. And it wasn't that I had seen it. I'd read about it. All my research had been leading to this. It is then that the book came together. And then I said to myself, yes, it is a quest for justice, which I think trumps everything else. People's belief in justice is visceral.
One last question and then we'll take the discussion outside the reception.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. My question goes back to Khaled, and you described very beautifully his perception of himself, his role in Egypt, his understanding of the Egyptian people. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how it is that he was perceived and whether some of the opposition that he faced was more to do with how it is that he was understood by the Egyptian people or his students. The reason I ask is I wonder whether some of it's related to his own faith or lack thereof, and whether that had something to do with the relationship he had with his students.
Thank you. No, as I said, Klo is a very difficult character. Like all of these complex figures, there is more than one persona. There is Klo that we read in his published books, and there's the Klo we encounter in the archives. Klo was the head of a huge establishment that he had founded. He's a founder of a school, but also a health establishment that became far-flung. He's a very astute politician. His enemies are actually not the ulama. His enemies are other Europeans who are either making quick money in Egypt or who do not really, who are not committed. And he doesn't want it. And his fights show a very clever person who's fighting for his turf, for his students, for his medical establishment, getting the funds, the buildings, and their prestige. They adored him. They really, I mean, their dedications to him are amazing. They really genuinely believed in him. Again, it's the question, did they believe in him because they've been whitewashed, I mean, brainwashed by, believing that I don't think so. These are people who are also equally complex figures, who are, this is only one side of what's happening, this science versus religion aspect. There's a class dynamic, there is a race dynamic, there is fights over money, there is fights between these Europeans about the nature of disease and the nature of epidemics. He believed in founding a nationwide medical health establishment, whereas many of his European colleagues wanted only to protect the European enclave. This is why, again, he was not a typical colonial medical man, unlike the Europeans in the British in India, who are mostly concerned with the colonial enclave. So he's a complex figure, and there are many aspects of it. And if you want to learn more, wait for the book.
Well, that's a perfect note on which to end, I think, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Professor Fahmy again for a fascinating.
Thank you so much.